He reread the book Isaiah Berlin, Alive by Michael Ignatieff, Chapter 10, Moscow, 1945. He was apprehensive about the journey, joking to a friend that he did not know what to bring with him. Insecticide, shoe leather, sealskin hats, or goodness knows what. In the event, Isaiah flew into Moscow on 8 September 1945, carrying winter clothing, small Swiss cigars with plastic holders, and a booth for Boris Pasternak, a gift from his sister in Oxford. He had longed to return. The idea of such a trip had been in his mind since his early 20s. But now that it was happening, he was full of apprehension. The Soviets might insist that he was a Soviet citizen because he had been born in Latvia and never let him out. He had a recurring nightmare of being arrested, and he told himself with an uncharacteristic grimness that if this would happen, he would simply shoot himself. He didn't have time to dwell on his anxieties because with his usual good luck, he arrived in Moscow just in time for an embassy party, at which he made contacts that were to open doors to the Russian artistic community throughout his stay. The embassy, situated in an ornate merchant's place on the river embankment directly opposite the Kremlin walls, was giving a dinner to celebrate the anniversary of its Russian language news sheet, Britansky Suznik, the British ally. The guest of honor was a tired and irritable J.B. Presley. During a misguided moment at the height of the British-Soviet wartime alliance, Presley had written that Soviet literature was the conscience of the world. Stalin's reward had been an official visit, complete with numbing tours of factories and collective farms. Presley was exhausted and quickly retired to his hotel bed, leaving Isaiah with Lena Prokofiev, the composer's Catalan ex-wife, the theater director Alexander Terevov, the critic and children's writer Kenny Chukovsky, and the film director Sergei Eisenstein. To their astonishment, they were now talking to a British official who not only spoke fluent Russian, but whose very form of thinking, Terov induced, was entirely Russian. Each of the men at the table, Isaiah soon realized, was crippled by fear. Stalin had recently viewed the second part of Einstein's Ivan the Terrible and had taken Einstein's portrayal of the Tsar as an allegorical denunciation of his own increasingly paranoid and savage rule. Stalin had apparently reprimanded the director in person. Not surprisingly, Einstein looked drawn and distracted. To draw him out, Isaiah asked him when he had been happiest. In the early 1920s, Eisenstein wistfully replied, when experimentation was still allowed. There had been a night in a Moscow theater, he said, when they had let grease-smeared pigs loose in the audience. Those had been the days the director Terov, who had been dismissed from the Kameny Theater by Stalin in 1939, agreed that the 1920s had been a good time. But the pre-revolutionary days of the Moscow Art Theater had been even better. Terov fondly recalled the work of Vsevolod Meyerhold. For Isaiah, Meyerhold, whose experimental work had made Moscow the most important theatrical center in Europe in the 1920s, was just a name. For this man, Meyerhold was also a fate and a warning. They knew only that he had disappeared. There were rumors that he had been seen in Tashkent during the war. In fact, he had been tortured and shot in 1940. Of this, Isaiah, of course, knew nothing. He asked them why all the artistic experimentation of the 1920s had come to an end. Things change, Terov said gloomily. Then, after a time, he added, things also do not change. This is even worse, and stared down at the tablecloths in silence, looking old and broken. From his first nights in Moscow, therefore, Isaiah had exposed to the atmosphere of gloom, shame, and terror among the scared ones who had managed to survive the Yuzhno-Kvetchina, the whole-scale extermination of the Russian intelligentsia in 1937. In addition to the millions of ordinary people went to labor camps or simply shot, the regime had exterminated the cultural elite, including the poet Osip Mandelstam, the brilliant short story writer Isaiah Babel, the theater director Meyerhold, the critic D.S. Minsky, and numberless others. By the time the killing and deportation were done, there was a vacant stillness in Russian culture, like a forest after an all-consuming fire. The pace of destruction slowed with the beginning of war. By 1941, some artists were allowed to join the national struggle against the Germans. Boris Pasternak and Anna Akhmatova had given readings, and the party discovered that the moral authority of these dissident figures was an asset to be exploited. At a time when the language of a patriotic appeal had been debased into crude slogans, these poets knew how to conjure up the most genuine source of a national affection, love of the Russian language. Common soldiers knew their work by heart or carried their poems around with them on scraps of paper. Now, in 1945, artists were gingerly testing the water, daring, for example, to accept invitations to the British embassy. But no one at the dinner knew whether the slight relaxation of the war years was a harbinger of better times to come, or whether the terror would return. As Isaiah was later to write, those who had survived were like Giotto's fresco of Jonah in the jaws of Leviathan, half swallowed by the whale. The most assured of the three Russians was Konny Chukovsky, a critic and a literary scholar of the pre-revolutionary era, who had survived the purges of the 1930s by turning himself into a blameless and, as it happened, inspired children's writer. His widespread popularity managed, at least for the time being, to protect him and his family. With Isaiah, he felt sufficiently secure to venture into nostalgic reminiscence of his penurious times in England before the Revolution. At the embassy dinner table, he took out of his vast pocket the penny edition of Thomas Hardy's Sartor Resartus, which he had used to teach himself English in London before the First World War. To Isaiah, he confessed a yearning for the novels of Trollope, especially the persons and the vicars of Barchester. His friend Evie Letourneur, British-born wife of the disgraced ex-foreign minister, shared his love of Trollope, but judged it too risky to send to England for more. Isaiah promised to oblige, and on his return to England, duly sent Chukovsky a package full of Trollope. Isaiah now asked whether he might ask a favor in return. Could Chukovsky arrange a meeting with Boris Pasternak? Isaiah had read My Sister Life and Maurice Bauer, who had published some of Pasternak's verses in wartime anthology, had suggested that a visit might be possible. Chukovsky, who had a dacha near Pasternak's in the artist colony at Pré-de-la-Kino, a short train journey from Moscow, said that his relations with the poet were difficult, but he promised to help. Leonard Prokofiev also volunteered to assist. With his knack for seizing the moment, Isaiah came away from his first nights in Moscow with an entree to Russian writers that Western diplomats regularly stationed there could only envy. The Western community in Moscow lived, he later wrote, in a kind of a zoo with intercommunicating cages, but cut off by a high fence from the outside world. He had found a way out of the cage. He ventured into the September Moscow, full of returning soldiers and stolid people from the countryside. Moscow still grappled by the euphoria of that famous ceremony in August 1945, when the flags and the banners of the defeated German legions had been flung onto the cobblestones of Red Square. Isaiah hadn't heard his native tongue being spoken in a city street since the age of 11. He eavesdropped on conversations. He explored the streets of the Arbad Quarter, descended into Stalin's metro, listened to the women in the queues outside bread shops, observing the Russian life from which he had been separated for 25 years. He browsed in the catalogs of the Lenin Library and then edged into the reading rooms, where he watched with some astonishment as young graduate students thumped their way through these, dutifully copying out the quotations that were officially approved for citation in their own work. But it was the experience of being bathed in the language again which moved him most. In a letter home, he exclaimed, "I had forgotten that such emotions and expressions existed." It soon became obvious that he was being followed. The sensation that there were trench-coated figures sliding in and out of the crowd behind him was uncomfortable, but not especially alarming. If he was frightened, he gave a little sign of it, except when he assured his parents that he was being most careful, well-behaved, discreet, etc., and emphatically did not go out for walks alone at 3 a.m. He lived in an embassy flat in the Arbad and told his family that he was at the ballet, theater or opera every night. Chekhov's Cherry Orchard, Prokofiev's Cinderella, and Tchaikovsky's Onegin were among the performances he saw. Most uncharacteristically, he even noticed the food he was eating: mushroom soups, peroshikis, borscht. He reported on the comic conversations he had with the maid in the embassy flat. "They say Stalin is very ill," he would venture. "No, the American ambassador saw him in Sochi, and he was in excellent form," Isaiah would reply. "Do you read Trotsky much?" "No." "He was a very good man, wasn't he?" She was a nice old thing, and her bungling attempts to entrap him on behalf of her employers were endearing rather than menacing. He also overheard her whispering to another maid that he was a very strange customer, slept in until 11. Savanen Agelechini, not at all like an Englishman. "Really," he told his parents, "these were the fullest weeks of my life." He told them, bursting with impressions, and when the first snows of autumn began to fall in October, his description of the scene, while ironic, was alive with a feeling. Quote, "Did I describe to you the crunching snow, the cupolas of the churches, the crisp air, the peasants, the fur caps, the Russian timbre of speech in the streets, the distant sound of a Red Army man singing as they march? It is all like almost a vulgarly sentimental rapine illustration." In Moscow, there were close family ties to renew. His father's brother, Leo, had settled in Moscow after the revolution and was now a professor of dietetics at the university. On 2 occasions, Isaiah slipped out of a ballet performance at halftime, eluding his pursuers in order to visit Leo and his wife and family in their Moscow flat, a cozy, cramped, book-lined refuge, full of Jewish cheer and Riga memories. On the second occasion, the entire Berlin clan assembled: his uncles Samuel and Solomon, and his aunt Evangenia, once married to Isaac Lundenberg and now separated from him. The last contact between the English and Russian Berlins had been 1935, when Mendel Berlin had visited Moscow with a timber delegation. So there was much catching up to do. Inquiries about health and business, though not any reckoning together of the loss of the entire family who had remained in Riga. This doleful subject was not mentioned, even though by then Isaiah suspected that no one had survived. Nor did the mild and charming Leo venture into political discussion. Even with his own nephew in his own house, politics was simply too dangerous a subject. He did let slip one remark that brought the realities of a Soviet life home into stark relief. When Isaiah struggled that life as a university professor might not be so bad after all, Leo asked him pointedly, "Have you been to Florence? Have you been to Venice?" Isaiah nodded, and Leo replied with a firm but quiet pungency, "We would like to go there too." Isaiah's attorney did pick up the impression that anti-Semitism in abeyance during the war was now making a return. One of his uncles, then still in Soviet Army uniform, hinted as much, though he did not elaborate. But Isaiah had no inkling of what lay in store, and Leo, for his part, was innocent too. When asked whether he was worried that the NKVD would soon pay them a visit, Leo cheerfully replied that he was more likely to visit them. Like the intellectuals at the embassy, he must have hoped that the war signaled the end of their hardships. In reality, they were just beginning. Okay, let me stop here.